This video is a follow-on from the previous 11 videos dealing with price in the precious metals markets. If you haven't seen those videos, I'd recommend you doing so before watching this one. So let's pick up where we left off and look at inflation some more. In the previous video, we looked at what inflation was and how to perceive it, and we also looked at the primary cause of inflation, massive currency creation. In this video, we'll look at the various adverse effects of inflation and how to protect yourself against it. So let's do that. I dare say that some of you might have heard the term shrinkflation. Manufacturers have to be competitive, but they are affected by inflation in a similar way to how consumers are. In an inflationary environment, the cost of production goes up. They necessarily have to pass this cost on to the consumer, because if they opt to absorb the rising costs, then their profits will diminish. Also, even if they choose to absorb the cost increase, then there's a limit to the amount of absorption that they can do. They have to make a profit or they'll go out of business, and then everybody suffers: the company, the employees of the company, and the people that buy the products. Consumers tend to be sensitive to any increases in prices of products. Knowing this, manufacturers are reluctant to put up prices. So instead of putting up prices, what manufacturers can do is to reduce the size of the product that they sell. The product shrinks in size. This is shrinkflation. I'm sure you've all noticed this phenomenon at some point in time. So if we assume a 10% inflation rate and consider an imaginary product, the manufacturer doesn't want to increase the price of his product and so opts instead to shrink the product's size. Assuming that the manufacturer passes all the inflation directly onto the consumer and also opts for shrinkflation, that product will then shrink by 10%. You're buying a product which is 10% smaller than it was before, but for the same price as before. The important thing to consider here is that the same amount of currency buys less product. For those of you listening to this who are more visually orientated, this should provide you with a very visual representation of the loss in purchasing power of a currency. Your purchasing power is diminishing before your eyes. The adverse effects of inflation vary depending on your financial status. Generally speaking, inflation affects the poorest sections of society the worst and the richest the least. The poor have to spend proportionately more of their income on food, etc., as compared to people who are better off financially. In an inflationary environment, the poor have to spend increasing amounts of the currency that they have on basic necessities. If they have any disposable income, this will diminish as inflation increases. The rich are therefore more insulated from the worst effects of inflation because their wealth acts as a buffer. Even if the prices of food are going up, they can afford to spend that extra money. So this reality reflects the great wealth inequality we see in societies today. As ever, the poorest sections of society suffer the most. Let's turn our attentions now to middle income earners. Savers are punished by inflation. In an inflationary environment, savings will lose value in real terms. To illustrate the pernicious effects of inflation, imagine you have $10,000 in a savings account in a bank. With inflation at 10%, this would mean that in 12 months' time, the real value of your savings would have lost 10%. The nominal value stays the same, so when you look at your balance, you'll see the sum of $10,000 in your savings account, but in real terms, it's lost 10% of its value. The ability of that $10,000 is less in terms of purchasing power, 10% less. So it's essentially on $9,000 in real terms. This is basic economics. If we assume the rate continues at 10% into the future, you're losing $1,000 per year in terms of purchasing power. Your savings will essentially be completely worthless in 10 years, although the nominal value will still stay at $10,000. Even if you get a 5% interest rate in your savings account, you're still losing due to the effects of inflation. When you look at your balance, you'll see the sum of, say, $10,500 in your savings account, which might seem like a good thing, but overall, in real terms, it's still lost a percentage of its value. If the interest on the savings account is 5%, but the inflation rate is 10%, then you're losing 5% in real terms. The inflation rate is probably near 10% in many countries now, and yet savings accounts have very low interest rates. Be advised, currencies are at present losing value with every passing moment, so if you have any currency in a bank, you're losing out. So leaving your hard-earned savings in a bank is a decision, but not a very wise one. Personally, I maintain a bank balance of near to zero at all times, only having enough currency in an account to pay for bills on direct debit, etc. Let's turn our attentions now to precious metals, as they are the primary focus of this mini-series. Precious metals like gold and silver are commonly seen as a hedge against inflation, and for good reason, because they are a store of value. They hold their value over time. Precious metals protect purchasing power because they retain value, unlike currencies. Currencies are crap and are, to my way of thinking, set to get a whole lot more crap. I refer you back to the third video in this mini-series where I talked about the differences between money and currency. Another way to say retain value is to say that precious metals preserve wealth. Precious metals are not adversely affected by inflation. Indeed, they tend to do well in inflationary environments, that is, in a free market. There is a caveat here, which I shall shortly talk about. What I've just talked about is really for those who are in the fortunate position to have some disposable income or savings that they can convert from fiat into precious metals. By the way, as I've made clear in other videos, this is not financial advice, so don't base what you do on what I've said without having done your own research and without having considered things very carefully indeed. Don't just take my word for it. Do your own due diligence. Investigate all these matters that I've spoken about and come to your own conclusions, but you might want to do so soon, as a matter of some urgency in fact. Why, you might ask, do we not see the price of precious metals keep track with inflation? Why indeed? This is a very good question. How is it possible that almost everything is moving up in price except for precious metals? The short answer is price suppression. We don't have any free markets. They're all managed, I would say manipulated. If precious metals were not suppressed and if there were free markets, we should see gold and silver tracking inflation. Our overlords can't allow this to happen because the decline of the dollar and other currencies would be recorded in terms of the rising price of precious metals. I refer you back to the second video in this mini-series if you want to know more about manipulation. No doubt there's a lot more that could be said, but in order to keep these videos short, under 10 minutes, I'll stop there. I split the topic into a number of videos, so there's another however many to follow. In the next video, I'll continue to talk about inflation, but with regard to the CPI, the narrative being disseminated about inflation and interest rates, and what I think will happen in the near future. Wise up and rise up.